Hey everyone, I'm going to tell you about all the things you can add to your prompt to get the best portraits in Midjourney. Midjourney V5 is actually really good at making ultra realistic images, so if you ask for a person, you're more than likely going to get something that resembles a portrait, but it's a good habit to include portrait in your prompt, especially at the beginning of your prompt. First, let's go over some of the aspect ratios you can use and which ones I recommend. Here is the prompt, a portrait of an Instagram model, synthwave style. Aspect ratio 1:1, so these are your square images. The square image is Midjourney's default, and I think it's okay to use. I don't think these are bad at all, but there are plenty more ratios we can use. And if you're curious where I got the idea of synthwave from, you can download my free PDF in the description. It's a visual dictionary of 200 aesthetics I put together. Granted, they were all made in version 4, so they might look different for you. However, it's not the pictures themselves, it's the style used to make the picture. Hopefully they'll give you some ideas, some inspiration on which words you can include in your prompts. Back to the aspect ratios. Instead of 1:1, 2:3 is a pretty good option. Honestly, as long as it's more vertical, you're going to get the most out of the portrait prompt. And I don't know if I need to explain this, but how prompting works in Midjourney is that it's going to relate any word you use to its database. So if you include the word portrait, it's going to look up every image it has that is tagged with the word portrait. A lot of those are going to be vertical, and we want to synergize our prompts as much as we can with the database. However, it's possible to go a little too vertical. Here is the aspect ratio 1:2. And perhaps you like the look of these pictures, but I don't. I think it's a little too squished. And even though Midjourney can fit some of it in frame like number 1, I think most of the time it's gonna have difficulty giving you everything you're looking for. On the other side of things, here's 16:9. Again, Midjourney is always going to create something beautiful, but the strength of the composition is going to be determined by which aspect ratio you choose. I can't recommend 16:9 for portraits. It's usually going to cut off something you're looking for. However, maybe that's what you want. Just keep it in mind. And that brings us to my personal favorite aspect ratio to use for portraits, and that's 4:5. This might be a little unconventional, but I think it gives you the perfect shape, almost like a DVD case. Not quite square, but enough verticality to show off what we want. 4:5. My favorite. And in case anyone is wondering, why are there 2 aspect ratios in my prompt? I've gotten only 1 comment about this in all of my videos. The reason for the different aspect ratios is because one of them is added as a suffix to all of my prompts, that being 16:9. And also V5 is a suffix for all of my prompts, so I don't have to type in V5 every time. You can change your suffix by hitting / and then prefer suffix. You can click on new value and then add anything you want that will be added to the ends of all your prompts. And this is good for when you want to experiment with something and you don't want to have to write it every time. So I personally like 16:9 and I want it there for most of my prompts. However, if you then include a different aspect ratio in your prompt, it will override your suffix. So I do portrait of an Instagram model, synthwave style, and then I write in AR 4:5, and that will become more important than the 16:9. Likewise, I could also add in V4 to my prompts, and that will become more important than the V5. When it comes to parameters, whatever comes first is what gets taken as the prompt. That's just a little side lesson. Let's get back to portraits. So you've seen the most basic type of prompt you can use, which is just including the word portrait and then maybe a style. But from here on out, our prompts are going to get more and more complicated as we introduce new words. I'll show you everything you can do. The first thing I think you should try is adding different stylized values. This can be written as --s and then a number between 0 and 1,000. And what the stylized value does is expands or constricts the creativity of Midjourney. High stylized value, lots of creativity. A lower stylized value, and Midjourney will generate more strictly to your prompt. Maybe that's something you're looking for, but my recommendation for portraits, for realistic images, is to bump up the stylized value. Here is S300, here's S500. The images are becoming slightly different than they used to be. Here's 750, and here's S1000. Honestly, I think you're going to become a fan of S1000. A high stylized value can do great things for photorealistic images. So that's the stylized parameter, but what about chaos? Don't be afraid of chaos when it comes to your portraits. It's written as --C and then a number between 0 and 100. And what this number is going to do is determine how much variety is in your initial grid of images. The highest chaos value will make sure each of the pictures barely looks like each other, like you'll actually get nonsense. But a low chaos value will be enough to give you 4 distinct images and perhaps really show you something you didn't even know you were looking for. Here is just the chaos value of 3. And despite the sunglasses, each of the pictures are quite distinct portraits. I like number 1 a lot. I do not recommend a high chaos value. Keep it low. But here's an extra tip for you. I suggest a combination of a small chaos value and some stylize. My personal favorite right now is C14 S300. That is subject to change and you can include any combination that you like. But look what it does to the images. These are so beautiful. The chaos makes each of them different from each other, and the stylized value just adds some creativity that is hard to put into words. Number 1 is great. Love the look, and number 3, I like them all. The next lesson I have for you has to do with the subject of your portrait as well as the color palette you use. Portrait of an Instagram model, but instead of just saying style, we're going to include the word fashion. In this case, Rococo fashion style. We're also going to add a camera type. Here I added Nikon photography. You can completely decide what kind of clothes your subject is wearing. However, the type of camera you mentioned, not exactly that important. Probably a good habit to get into, but I have to stress that whether it's Nikon or Canon or Sony or just the word DSLR, all of those do the same thing. There is a slight caveat I'll go through later, but for now I really just want to focus on the fashion style and then the idea of a color tone, like here. Portrait of an Instagram model, Rococo fashion style, Nikon photography, sepia tone. This is how we'll get a sort of vintage look to our generation. But let's say I wasn't quite happy with the framing of these compositions. I can then include the words full body at the start of the prompt. And as you can see, the camera is zoomed out a little. It's still the idea of a portrait, but full body will bring your full subject into frame. And that might be important to you. And this is of course with the sepia tone, but here's an extra tip on the idea of color. If we take that full prompt and turn it into a multi-prompt while adding a weight to the sepia tone, you're gonna get something a little different. So here's the same thing, only we put 2 colons after the first part of the prompt, then we have the word sepia tone followed by 2 colons and then the number 2. You can include any number, but for this example, the number 2 means that sepia tone is twice as important as the rest of the prompt. Now, I just want to point out how different these pictures are from the previous one. Just adding a double weight to sepia tone can change it so much. Keep that in mind when you're playing around with colors and different words. Consider multi-prompting them and adjusting the weight to really fine-tune your prompt. This is going to be a long video. And let's say you wanted black and white photos. What can we do? This example is really simple. Portrait of an Instagram model, Rococo fashion, Nikon photography, black and white at the end. And it works out great. You can understand why some people are concerned about where they put certain words in the prompt, because for sure at the end of a long prompt, Midjourney is going to have a hard time incorporating every word you use. However, in this case, black and white, Midjourney seems to understand fine what we were asking for. Alternatively, you could put black and white at the front of your prompt, black and white portrait of an Instagram model, etc, etc. These turned out great. Perhaps they look a little different than including it at the end of the prompt, although I think that's just a variation in the seeds. I don't think it matters much, but I want you to remember the different colors you can include and the idea of multi-prompting them and adjusting the weights. I hope you're having fun learning so far. The next lesson in portrait prompting is something you can add to your subject and something you can include in the background. I know this is 16:9, but bear with me because full body shot actually works pretty well in a 16:9. However, the thing I want to focus on here is the pose. I included contemplating pose in my prompt. This is going to determine how your subject sits in the photo. I think there are a bunch of different words you can use in terms of the pose, and I think this is something worth experimenting on. The second thing I added to the prompt was a Victorian set background. Here's the same thing in 4x5, and look how beautiful these are. The pose really brings a mood to the photo, and specifying the background can present a really interesting atmosphere. This next lesson has to do with the last part of the prompt, the camera that we mentioned. Here I got rid of the sepia tone and we have Nikon photography. These look pretty good. Here's the same prompt with Canon photography. Remember how I said it didn't really make a difference? I personally think that the only difference between these pictures and the previous ones is the seed number. Changing the name of the camera, not that big of a deal. However, including the word unsplash rather than a camera type can make a pretty big difference. And I personally am a huge fan of unsplash. I think the contrast and the lighting is very specific to Unsplash, which is actually just a stock photography website that all contain a certain style of image. And Midjourney represents that style really, really well. As you can see, Midjourney is not perfect yet. Number one is kinda cursed. She has 3 arms. We're just gonna ignore that. But I like number 3 a lot. I think that's so beautiful. And number 4, that's a gorgeous, gorgeous portrait. I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you. I hope you're writing some of it down. There's still more to know about. And let me know if you have any questions in the comments. And if you've learned something new so far, please consider hitting the like button on this video so we can share it with more people. Thanks. Now that you know the basic portrait formula, let me show you some of the changes you can make and how you could spice it up a little. Full body shot of an Instagram model, triumphant pose, science fiction set background, Rococo fashion style, unsplash. Look how cool these images are. These are sick. It's hard to determine which words affect these images the most, but I think Unsplash really gives these catwalk looking vibes. And of course, Rococo fashion brings the fashion. Full body shot of an Instagram model, triumphant pose, science fiction set background, intricate pastel fashion, and then instead of Unsplash or a specific camera, you could just include the words cinematic scene, dramatic lighting. When you're working with this pro mode of version 5, the more specific you can get is never a bad thing. So Unsplash is basically synonymous with cinematic scene, dramatic lighting. Do you know what I mean? They're kind of interchangeable. And I think these turned out great. And perhaps pastel fashion is more in line with science fiction, whereas before the Rococo fashion maybe clashed with the science fiction and Midjourney didn't really know what to do. Like that's a cool picture. Here's another example of how you can mix up that formula. Contemplating pose, Neolithic set background, maximalism fashion style. This is where we're kind of mixing the ancient world with some newer fashion. A pretty cool dichotomy. Okay, this next lesson is pretty advanced but pretty important, especially if this is what you're looking for. Let's say you want a portrait of something, but you don't want it to be photorealistic. How do you do that? Because the word portrait is so closely associated with a lot of real life portraits. Well, let me tell you, the solution is negative prompting. Now, I've talked about negative prompting in previous videos, and it basically involves using the parameter --no and then any words that you don't want included in the generation. However, that's not the only way to do negative prompting. You can also divide your prompt into multi-prompts using 2 colons, and instead of adding a normal weight to increase the importance of a part of the prompt, we can add a negative weight to decrease the importance. So here I tried portrait of an Instagram model maximalism style, and maximalism is quite the extravagant aesthetic. I loved it in version 4, and I wanted it to be represented here, but something about these were a little too realistic. I wanted the style to be part of the generation rather than just what's inside the portrait, if that makes any sense. Here's portrait of an Instagram model, maximalism style, colon, and then we're just gonna use the word photography, add 2 colons, and then as the weight, we're gonna choose negative 0.75. And look at these results. This is basically exactly what I wanted. So now we know how to take the realism out of our portraits. What else can we do? If you're at this stage, what I recommend is changing the stylized value. Here's the same prompt as before, only we're going stylized 0, which means it's going to follow our prompt very strictly. Maybe making it less beautiful, just so you know. I've said before, I like higher stylized values, and this might be an okay example of why. They're just not always that beautiful. I got some better examples later. Here's S500, and like these are These are so sick. I think that's so awesome. 750. I've heard a lot of people like 750, and I can see why. And then look at Stylized 1000. I am a big fan, can't get enough. Remember to negative prompt out the realism. So those were good examples of what the stylized value can do when you don't want it to be photorealistic, but the effect of stylized on your base prompts cannot be understated. Portrait of an Instagram model, maximalism style. Just look how good these are. Maximalism style, S750. I think the crazier styles you try to invoke, the higher the stylized value should be. Here's S1000, and I think these are honestly my favorites. I have to blur number 4 out. Even though it's tasteful, Midjourney still dabbles in nudity for some reason, and I don't really know why, and apparently the developers don't really know why either. It's just like a kind of a funny quirk. Here's a good example of why I prefer the high stylized values. I don't think S0 looks very good at all, but you might like what it brings to the table. That's up to you. And this next quick lesson has to do with the type of portrait we're trying to invoke. Here I went with digital illustrated portrait of an Instagram model, maximalism style, the negative prompted photography, and I'm a pretty big fan. I think you could do a lot with this type of prompt. Here's cell shaded portrait, same idea. I love number 3. I think that's so good. Number 1's pretty cool too. Graphic novel portrait, same idea. If you didn't negative prompt photography, these would look wildly different. Here's some examples of staying with a certain style, but changing the tone. Portrait of an Instagram model, maximalism style, sepia tone. Love how these came out. S1000, by the way. Same prompt, split into multi-prompt, sepia tone with a weight of 2. Look how different these look. Can't stress this enough. If you're going for a certain color tone to the photos, consider multi-prompting and changing the weights. Here's black and white, and another tip, using the word monochrome works the same way. Beautiful photos. Also monochrome at the start of your prompt, same thing. Works just fine. I mentioned earlier how the camera type doesn't really matter, although I want you to look at these and tell me what you think. These next examples, I've adjusted the size of the lens mentioned in the prompt. Do you think there's a difference? Here's Nikon 85mm. Here's 10mm. Is there a difference? I know it's hard to tell just based on one random seed, but is there a noticeable difference? I don't know. However, I do know that specifying the type of lens makes a big difference. Here's Nikon fisheye lens. Look at these. These are very distinct. I upscaled all of them because I like them so much. Oof. Number 1 I thought was going to be the thumbnail, but I kind of like number 2. I don't know. What do you guys think? What would you click on? I got a couple more things to show you. I hope this isn't too much information, but consider this like a master class. Portrait of an Instagram model, maximalism style, DSLR. What do you notice about these pictures? They all have a camera in them. One way to get around this, if you like using the word DSLR or any type of camera that happens to show up in your pictures, you're just going to negative prompt camera. Simple as that. You can write -- no camera, or just separate camera from the rest of your prompt with 2 colons, add 2 colons after the camera, and put a negative weight of like 0.75, something like that. Maybe I didn't mention this before, but when you negative prompt with no, I think everything gets a weight of 1. However, when you use the negative weight on a multi-prompt, you can adjust how much negative value you want a word to receive. Okay, another example of why a low stylized value kinda sucks for photorealistic portraits. Full body shot of an Instagram model, Fauvism style, contemplating pose. Fauvism have these crazy colors, as you can see here. Here is S0. These are all right, but they're not that great. However, here is S1000. These are amazing. You see a pretty big difference, right? And that's just the stylized value. Otherwise, it's the same prompt. Same thing here. Sanrio Core style S0. Awful images. S750, pretty sick. I like these a lot, except she's got a floating fist here. Don't look too closely. S1000, I'm a fan. And I should mention here, if anything is slightly wrong in one of your pictures, just hit variations. This doesn't work like version 4. It's not going to give you the exact same photo with the smallest detail change. It's going to reimagine the photo pretty distinctly. Like here, number 1 is way better than what it was before. Some of the others don't work that well, but The point is, if something is slightly wrong, hit variations, you'll probably get something you like. Here's a little side note on generating vintage portraits. Let's say you were using the sepia tone, but the pictures were looking too crisp and clean, and you wanted them to look like they were made in the olden days. You can use multi-prompts and use the words damaged photo, torn abrasive marks, and then include a weight that's under 1. You want it to just be a little accent. And I think honestly 0.8 is probably even a little too much. Here's the same prompt with 0.5, and I think these are starting to look a lot better. Tweak the weights on a multi-prompt. Here's the same thing for a portrait, so it's more zoomed in, not the full body. And I include sepia tone here, but look at this. Here's the same prompt without including sepia tone, and I think these look a lot more realistic to what we know as old photos. Now on to the final lesson of portrait prompting. Can you specify the attributes of your subject? The answer is surprisingly yes. Kind of. Portrait of an Instagram model, blonde hair, blue eyes, psychedelica style, Nikon 10mm, S1000. Psychedelica, not so much, but the point is, you can say blonde hair, blue eyes, and you'll get someone with blonde hair and blue eyes. That's pretty powerful. Curly brown hair and emerald green eyes. These are exactly what I was looking for. Curly brown hair, green eyes. Now, I think there is a big difference between exaggerating the color and just plainly stating it. Emerald green sort of adds maybe a fantastical post-process element, whereas just saying green eyes can get you these pretty normal looking photos. Like, look how good number 2 is. Like, she's so beautiful. Portrait of a humanoid Instagram model, spiky black hair, city pop style. I'll be honest, this didn't work out that well. I was going for like a robot and a super colorful city pop aesthetic. It didn't get that, but it got the spiky black hair. I added in the word robot, and these are again pretty cool. I like number 2. Added in the word unsplash, and it changes up the composition a little bit. So keep in mind, maybe some parts of your prompts will have to be tweaked with multi-prompting if at first Midjourney doesn't blend all of it together the way you want it. Like here, I tried negative prompting photography and then adding in anime, and I think these look pretty good. I'm a big fan. I think 1 is hilarious. Number 2 is actually quite beautiful. If I could get every single generation to look like that, I'd make the coolest comic book in the world, man. Going back to the curly brown hair and green eyes, I added a little bit of chaos with C3. And again, remember, that's a really important lesson anytime you're generating in Midjourney. A little bit of chaos will spread the variety around your grid, and maybe you'll find what you're looking for. Platinum blonde hair, purple eyes. Didn't quite get this, and perhaps I would need to include multi-prompting and bump up the weight on purple eyes. Platinum blonde hair, purple eyes, Victorian background, unsplash. These turned out great. As you can see, I'm just adding in other parts of the formula at different stages to see what it brings. Love these. Here's a similar example as before, cel-shaded portrait, and it didn't really do that well. However, cel-shaded portrait and then photography negative prompted, you get the opposite of realistic. Cel-shaded portrait, negative prompted photography, animate with a weight of 0.8, and I'm starting to get a little more of what I thought I wanted. But look how cool these look. Like, if you want that style, you're gonna have to get it through multi-prompting. For this next one, I took out unsplash and the camera. I think number 3 looks great. Cel-shaded portrait of an Instagram model, platinum blonde hair, glowing purple eyes, cyberpunk background. Look at number 3, man. Look at number 1. These are, oh, they're all so good. Bringing in different stages of the portrait formula can give you vastly different results. Now let me go over the formula. You want the word portrait, then you mention your subject, followed by anything you would use to describe them, maybe some attributes, or maybe their fashion, how you want them to look. Then you can include the background, followed by a camera, not that important, and then maybe a color tone. And using all or just some of that formula is going to get you some pretty cool pictures in Midjourney. I hope you learned something new. I hope you're doing well. Take care, and I'll see you next time. Peace.